Am I sorted in the frame?
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you, Madam Toastmaster. I didn't know who Clive Palmer was. It turns out Mr. Palmer, or Dr. Palmer, as he sometimes refers to himself inaccurately, is an Australian billionaire. He got rich by discovering a bunch of gold ore somewhere, started a mining company. The next thing you know, he bought a shipping company, and now he spends his money doing really oddball things. One of them is that he has decided to build a replica of the Titanic, a copy of the ship, the Titanic. It's supposed to be done by the summer of 2022, and it will take its maiden voyage from Southampton, England, to New York City, which is what the original Titanic was supposed to do when it sank. Now, obviously, it's not going to be a perfect replica of the original ship. It has to meet modern standards for safety and so on. It'll have modern propulsion and navigation, electronics and all that. But the interior of the ship, all of the elaborate fittings, the passenger cabins, the way the hallways look and all that, are supposed to be perfect replicas of the original ship. By the way, you might want to start saving your pennies because it'll cost about $10,000 to make a one-way passage of the Atlantic on that ship. Now, the original Titanic, of course, did not finish its maiden voyage because it ran into an iceberg off the coast of Newfoundland on April 15th, 1912. And that is an interesting thing too, and that brings up the image that I just passed out to you. Now, obviously it's a black and white image, but you see that dark area on the far left? In real life, that was red paint. And the picture was taken by an officer on a German ship that stopped there the morning after the Titanic sank in order to look for survivors, of which there were none, since everybody went into 28-degree water. And he noticed the bright red paint on the side of the iceberg, took the picture. That paint matches the color that the White Star Line put on the lower hulls of all of its ships. The White Star Line was the line that the Titanic was part of. So that's the actual iceberg that the Titanic ran into. And I got to thinking, everybody talks a lot about the Titanic, and all of us are more or less familiar with it because there's a high likelihood that we all saw that 1996 film, Titanic. That film, now the romance story that drives the film is totally fiction. Those people didn't exist, and had they existed, they would never have touched each other's paths because of the way the ship was set up. But all of the scenes dealing with the collision with the iceberg, the evacuation of the ship, the sinking and all that, were historically accurate. So if you saw that movie, you know what happened when the Titanic went down. It was a very bad day for about 1,500 people. The good news was that the day didn't last very long after they went into the water, but that's a different story. But I get to thinking, nobody talks about the iceberg, and that's actually the central feature in the whole emergency. And I realized I didn't know anything about icebergs other than that they're big chunks of ice that are floating around in the ocean. It turns out there's an interesting history to that particular iceberg. People who study icebergs, and there are people who actually study icebergs, believe it or not, realize that what happens is this: the snow falls somewhere, and then more snow falls upon that snow until it's compressed into something called firn, F-I-R-N, and that's a state of existence that's more in between ice and snow, is what it amounts to. And as more and more and more and more snow falls on the land, in this case Greenland, the firn gets compressed until it is rock solid ice. Now, if it gets heavy enough, what happens is that the bottom fraction of an inch below that ice turns back into water, and the ice starts sliding down, in this case toward the sea. Greenland is mostly covered with glaciers. There are 3 gigantic ones. And the iceberg that sank the Titanic, that iceberg came from the glacier that formed on western Greenland. And as the glacier gets to the edge of the water, there's nothing to support the ice, and pieces of it snap off and they become the icebergs. Those of you who have been on Alaskan cruises may have actually seen that, seen the glaciers calving off of the icebergs calving off of the glaciers. This particular glacier was very big. It's a building-sized glacier, obviously, and when the ship ran into it, what happened is the Titanic was called unsinkable, and that's because It had 16 watertight compartments, and it could stand up to 4 of them being breached. Unfortunately, 5 of them caved in. The water came in at about twice the rate that it could be pumped out. The ship went down in about 2 hours. Now, the interesting thing about that water that formed that glacier was that when they drill down into glaciers, they can get pores that are very much like tree trunks. There are rings, growth rings, and they can just count them to tell how old some of the snow was. They set the dates by seeing like layers of ash and whatnot, and they know that a volcano erupted at a certain time, so that sets one date and so on. The original snow that started the glacier that the Titanic ran into fell in roughly the year 1000 BC. Wow. So King Tut was the pharaoh of Egypt when that, what amounted to the iceberg that sank the Titanic began forming. It went into the water probably 6 months or so, maybe a year ahead of the sinking. And they know that because it had to drift down from Greenland all the way into the North Atlantic. Most of the glaciers from Greenland stay in the Arctic Ocean. About 30,000 of them a year calve off of the 3 glaciers on Greenland. Most of those icebergs stay in the Arctic Ocean. This one made it all the way down to the Northern Atlantic. The water temperature in April when the Titanic went down was only 28 degrees, which was bad enough to kill the people who were aboard. But that's way too warm for icebergs. And so the assumption is that the scientists have is that that iceberg probably melted within about 6 months after the Titanic hit it. So there you have it. The star of the actual Titanic disaster was the iceberg. And that iceberg began its existence when King Tut was ruling Egypt.